Hello, and welcome to today's QDU Academy session. Today, we're going to be looking at the Round 1 topic for Grade 10 for 2025. And that topic is that military leaders should be directly elected by citizens whilst remaining subject to the authority of elected civilian leaders. In this session, as with all QDU Academy sessions, we're going to cover the context behind the debate, we're going to cover some setup, which is your definitions and your models. I'm then going to go into some tips for how I think you should approach brainstorming points for this particular debate. And then we'll go into a couple of sort of revision tips from last year about structuring points and rebuttal, and then briefly also onto POIs as well. So let's start with the context behind the debate. The context behind the debate sort of answers the question of why is this debate taking place? It's all of the stuff that I think it's worth doing some work to research before you begin to write your actual cases for the debate. So I think that there are a few things that are worth understanding quite well before you start to write your points for this debate. And I think that this is one where you really should do a bit of research just to sort of wrap your head around the context that this debate is taking place within. The first question is you want to have a good idea of what specifically the decisions that military leaders make are. The reason for this is that this is the point of difference in the debate. The debate is not necessarily about anything political that they are not going to decide. It is about they are going to get elected because they say that they are going to do a certain thing. What is that certain thing? So you want to have a good idea of that to start off with, I think. The next thing is you want to have a good idea of how are they currently decided. The reason why this is such an important question is that this debate is partly about are individual citizens going to be good decision makers, but it is also about are they going to be better decision makers than whomever is taking charge, if not them. The reason why this is quite important is that you don't want to fall into the trap where you think of a whole bunch of arguments for why individuals are going to be really, really bad at making these decisions and forget to think about why the alternative is even worse, or the complete opposite if you're on the affirmative side, I guess. So you want to have a good idea of that. The last thing, and this kind of ties into the first question actually, is what military decisions do elected leaders make? Because remember, the topic tells you that the military leaders are still subject to the decisions of elected leaders. So I think the really, really big example here, right, is that elected leaders are the ones that are going to declare wars. Military leaders are not going to be running on the basis of saying, I'm going to start this war, because they do not have the power to. Instead, the question is, how do you think they will react when the elected leader makes a decision? Now, part of this, there's a bit of crossover, right? Presumably military leaders also serve as advisors to elected civilian leaders, but the final say does not lie with them on some issues. And you want to have a good idea of which ones those are so that you're not spending the whole debate talking about the side of the debate that actually isn't going to be affected by this topic. This is not an exhaustive list, and I suspect there is definitely more that you can research. But I think that these questions are the ones that, if you don't have a good idea of, it's likely that you'll end up down the wrong direction of the debate in some capacity. You want to have a good idea of what is the alternative, so how do we currently decide military leaders, and what decisions do they make, and specifically decisions that affect people, I guess. The next thing to go through is defining the topic. I think that there are a few words that are particularly important to define in this topic. The first thing is you want to define military leaders. Oh, I should have said just before, like the caveat here is that a lot of this is going to cross over with your model. It might be that you define something and then you realize, I'm going to not put this in my definition because I'm going to explain in my model. But I'll put through here all of the words that I think could have ambiguous definitions and are worth defining. Firstly, yeah, military leaders. This is a big question because the military is super hierarchical. There are loads and loads of positions that are technically leaders in that they have people that answer to them. But what level are the actual leaders that we're going to care about for this debate? For example, you could make it a lot of the leaders at many different layers of command. It would also be totally reasonable, in my opinion, for an affirmative team to say that this is about specifically the head of the Army, the head of the Navy, the head of the Air Force. And those are the only ones that are going to be elected because there's just no point electing the people below them or something like that. But you want to define clearly what they are so that this doesn't become a messy part of the debate. Next thing, we say that they're elected by citizens. I mean, this is just like an easy caveat is like, presumably you're going to have the same restrictions on voting that already exist for other elections. But, if you don't want to, go ahead. The last thing is just, I put the whole bit in brackets, just to remind you, that is, whilst remaining subject to the authority of elected civilian leaders. This is basically the topic telling you to point out that they do not make every decision and that there are some decisions that are still made by elected leaders, just like define clearly what this looks like, the fact that they are going to listen to those. The more critical part of this is modeling. And I cover the definition a bit quickly because I think almost everything that's worth defining is worth modeling a lot of the time. There's a few questions that I think you have. And the rule of thumb for knowing whether something is a worthwhile question in modeling is, would it be like an immediate follow-up if someone told you that they were just going to do the topic tomorrow? And I think there's a lot of questions I'd have. The first thing is, how do you reckon they're going to be elected? Are they going to be elected in the same way that we already elect many positions in Australia, which is to say preferential / optional preferential voting? Who is eligible to run for this? Is it the case that you already have to have some kind of military title in order to run for this office, or can anyone run for this office? The bit in brackets is just part of the model, but say it anyway. Yeah, I think there's a few questions like that. You might want to answer the question of like, how frequently will this happen? Do you plan for it to line up with other elections? So do we vote for this at the same time as we vote for like the House of Representatives and the Senate? Or is it at a slight time delay for that? The big thing here, and I think the useful thing, is that there's not necessarily right or wrong answers to this. I don't think you're going to screw yourselves over by picking a particular answer. I think there are possibly preferable answers and non-preferable answers, but I don't think there's anything that's going to break the debate for affirmative. The big thing is that not having an answer might break the debate if the teams just have different conceptions and they do not clarify outwardly that those are their conceptions. From negative, you might consider having a counter model. I'm not sure it's necessary. The big thing is make sure you do your research firstly to answer the question of how do we currently decide it. And if you find out that it's something that seems pretty decent, keep it that way. If you do some research and you find out that it's something and you find it a bit questionable, you're unsure about its merits, yeah, then feel free to suggest some kind of other alternative. But keep in mind that because negatives specifically cannot have them be voted by citizens, I'm not sure that you're going to find a new counter model that isn't already covered by the status quo. So you probably won't have a counter model, but I think it's definitely something that it's worth researching in case you find that there is something. In terms of brainstorming point ideas, I think you can just continue using the same kind of steps to brainstorm point ideas in year 10 as you have been previously. I think what this looks like is trying to work out, firstly, who are all of the groups that are likely to be affected? How are they going to be affected? So, for example, clearly military leaders are going to be affected. Clearly citizens are going to be affected. Clearly the rest of the military is going to be affected. Potentially the rest of parliament is going to be affected. There might be other groups. These are just the immediate ones that came to mind. You can definitely think of more, I'm sure. But you want to think, how are they all going to be affected? Why is this good or bad? The additional thing I think is worth thinking of in terms of developing quite sophisticated points is, how do you think they're going to react to the kind of effect that you're going to place on them? Because it's easy to find out military leaders now affected in that they are campaigning to be voted in by people rather than by some kind of internal power structure. How do they react? How does this change the kinds of things that they say that they're going to do, or maybe that they do? Maybe this like means that people that want to become leaders try and like be really public facing. Maybe it doesn't mean that. Maybe people are skeptical of the military and people would far rather vote for experts than people that seem to want it too much. I don't know. I think you could argue in either direction. This is just a hint that it's something that's worth thinking about. I think particularly you want to think about what this campaign is likely to look like. What does it look like for someone to run for the office of being a military leader? What kinds of promises are they going to make? How is the public going to react to those promises? What kinds of things are going to win out? Even though this is not necessarily a high stakes outcome, it's going to affect massive outcomes, depending on what kinds of messaging you think is going to be particularly persuasive or unpersuasive. So that's just a big thing that I think is definitely worth keeping in mind. In terms of structuring arguments, just continue structuring arguments the way you have been before, which is generally trying to go from like a problem to a solution, make it really clear what the outcome you're achieving at the end of your points is, and make sure that it's really clear why that outcome is so important. Remember that things like statistics and evidence and examples, while they are useful, should not be used as a substitute for logic. Logic is used as the most useful thing to prove that things are common most of the time in debating. Logic proves that things are usually true, whilst examples prove that things have definitely been true one time. What's best is to focus on the logic and then use examples to back up that logic after the fact. In terms of rebuttal, I think keep using the same tips as before. Focus on responding to the meat of an argument. Don't respond to point labels. Respond to the reasons the other team gives for why their points are true. Focus on explaining why their points are illogical rather than poking holes in examples, for the same reason that everything that makes a point persuasive, the absence of it makes a point unpersuasive. And so if examples are less critical to a good point, not having examples is going to mean less in terms of proving that a point is bad. And remember that you can rebut as much as you like in a debate, particularly as a third speaker. You've now got 7-minute speeches. Spend so much time on rebuttal. Don't spend your extra minute doing more of a summary, because rebuttal is what's going to change the adjudicator's mind at third. But the big thing that I'm sure you're all kind of here for, POIs, let's talk about them. Let's start with the rules of POIs. POIs are questions that you ask to the other team during their speech. Now, you can offer them between the first and the last minute of a speaker's speech, not in the first minute and not in the last minute. But there will be a bell at 1 minute and a bell at 6 minutes. Between those bells, you can ask POIs. In terms of how many POIs, each speaker should accept 2 POIs. And that means that as a rule, I think you should try and offer 2 POIs per speaker per speaker. And what that means is obviously that each team tries to offer 6 POIs per speaker, which gives them the opportunity to accept 2 of them and reject 4 of them. When you get offered a POI, there are 3 things you can say in response. First, you can say, no, thank you. They will sit down. They will not ask you a question. They'll continue writing and they'll stand up later with a question again. You can say, yes, please. They will ask you the question. You will then respond. Or you can say, I'll take that in a second, basically saying you're about to take the POI, but you just want to finish this sentence or this train of thought so that you don't lose it. And then you accept the POI. In terms of how long a POI should be, they should be no more than 15 seconds in my mind. A POI response should try and be in good faith, so do your best to respond to the question, but don't spend a ton of time on it. A good rule to keep in mind is that your speeches have increased in time by 1 minute from last year. If you on net spend more than a minute of your speeches talking about POIs, either being receiving them or responding to them, you will actually have less time in your speech than you would have last year, despite your time going up by a minute. So you should generally try and keep your POI responses to 15 seconds or less, as well as the POIs that you're offering, because that means that in total, last year you will have had 6-minute speeches. This year you'll have basically 6-minute speeches, but with an extra minute of POIs as well. In terms of the last rule I'll say is, if your POI doesn't get accepted, you can try and ask that same question again. Obviously, if they have accepted your POI, don't try and get them to answer the same question twice. But if they said no, you can then ask that same POI again. Just wait about 15 to 20 seconds before standing up again so that you're not sort of pestering them too much. Here are the strategies of POIs. POIs can firstly be used to clarify the other team. Particularly in this debate, if there's something that the affirmative team doesn't make clear, and as the negative team you think that your arguments kind of rely on understanding it, ask a POI that just tries to clarify it. So for example, if they don't say what the rules are for eligibility to run for military office, seems like a good question to understand, because if the answer is that anyone can run, there will be arguments that you can have. If the argument is that only some people can run, there might be arguments that you can have as well. But you can't run both of them at the same time because they rely on different ideas of what the topic is about. So start with that to work out POIs that serve the purpose of clarifying the other team's case. Now, you might be thinking, well, won't this make the other team's case make more sense because they'll be clarifying something? Yes, but the idea is that it also makes your job easier in terms of rebuttal because it's clearer what you're rebutting. So it's kind of a win-win situation. It just makes the debate as a whole a bit cleaner. The second purpose of POIs is to talk about your own arguments. The idea here is that when you're about to deliver a point, it can help to try and force the other team to have a go at rebutting your points before you've fully given them. The idea is you ask a POI that's kind of your case in disguise to the speaker beforehand, and try and get them to respond, and they probably won't do a great job. This is useful because it means that your points continue to be relevant. You can also do this to third speakers. If you had a really fun point at first affirmative and you think it hasn't gotten enough of a response, POI part of the argumentation of that point to a third neg speaker, just to sort of remind the adjudicator that that point was said, that point mattered, you thought that point was important, and the other team has not given it enough thought. Make sure you keep that in mind as well. The last purpose of POIs is to sort of talk about the other team's case. And this is like, instead of using POIs to be your case in disguise, it's sort of POIs to be used as rebuttal in disguise. So it's kind of using POIs to poke a hole in the other team's point, pointing out something that they haven't thought about, that kind of thing. The tricky thing with POIs is that they are really, really context dependent. I can't really give you a good example of, well, this was a fantastic POI, with also sort of explaining exactly how the debate was working up to that point, at which point it's not that useful because no two debates are going to be exactly the same. But hopefully, as you do POIs throughout the year, you'll gain a bit of sort of pattern recognition, for want of a better term, of what POIs seem to have been harder for the other team to respond to, what POIs seem to have been easier, and you'll offer more of the hard ones, the ones that you think you can do the most with. That's the sort of rule of thumb. The big thing is, like, year 10s are new to POIs, and POIs are new to year 10. I'm not going to be expecting a ton from the POIs I watch year 10s give this year. I'm mostly just going to be really happy to see people having a go. And even if it means it's not fantastic, especially early on in the year, that's okay, because I kind of just trust that people will improve over time. Just have a go at them, and that's most of the challenge. And that's kind of the point of POIs. It's not that it's going to be the best argumentation you've ever done, but it's an opportunity to engage with the other team in a different way, and that makes it worthwhile as well. Thank you very much for sitting through and listening through to all of this. Obviously, if you're watching this, you've clearly found the YouTube channel already, but stick around if you want more explanation about things. Feel free. We have a video about POIs as well that is on here. It will focus less on the strategy and more of the rules and conventions. But if you're a bit confused by anything, feel free to have a look there. Although do keep in mind, it will probably talk about year 11 and 12 timings. Your timings are different. And so the one specific thing is it will probably say that POIs are offered between 1 and 7. POIs are offered between 1 and 6 for year 10 because your speech is a 7. But everything else in that video should probably be correct. So feel free to have a look at that. I probably also explained POIs a bit for the first year 11 video of last year because they were new to POIs then. So feel free to have a look at that if you have anything that you're uncertain about. But otherwise, thank you very much for sitting through. Best of luck for this debate. Best of luck for all of your debates in the future. Hope you're enjoying debating.